Many quilters stay away from triangles because they're unsure how to make them. Well, we're going to change that today. I'm Lea Louise from Inspired Quilting by Lea Louise, and I'm going to share my 5 best creative tips for better flying geese. You're going to love this. My first tip for you for making the easiest flying geese is to use the no-waste flying geese method. It is such a time saver. It saves money, and it just makes such an accurate resulting flying geese block. You are going to love how this works. So let me show you step by step and how to find the best methods that work for you to get the most accurate flying geese blocks. Tip number 2 is cutting accuracy. And by that, I mean every square needs to be spot on. You need to have everything line up well in order to have an easy flying geese block. If things are skewed, for example, if you don't press, if this is not pressed flat or these are not pressed flat, when you cut them, they're not going to fit together well because you may have wrinkles, it may fold over, and the lines you draw may end up not being straight. So you press it and then you cut it. When you cut it, you want to use a ruler that has the markings that you can see and cut each side to make sure you've got a good square. And then also as important is when you mark your blocks, that you mark them accurately, which means corner to corner. So I'm going to go over this in detail to show you some steps you can take in order to get the best accuracy possible. We all love making patchwork quilts, and squares and rectangles are pretty easy to put together. You sew some straight lines, you get some square blocks, you put them together, and a beautiful quilt results. I want to show you how to up your game just a little bit with a few triangles. We're going to talk about flying geese, and the flying geese is made with 3 pieces of fabric. It has a primary triangle and then 2 small triangles on each side to create a rectangle. So we have our goose and we have our sky. Now, in order to do that, the old-fashioned method, the original way that used to be done, was we would take a rectangle, and it would be twice as long as it is wide, and we would take this and sew this piece this way. Cut that off, set it aside, and roll this up to create side 1. Then we would bring in our next square, sew it at an angle, cut this off, and this becomes waste. This is where we're talking about no waste. And then here's our flying goose. Well, I tell you, if you like half square triangles, this may be the best way for you to go because you're going to get a ton of extra. For every flying geese block that you make, you're going to get 2 smaller half square triangles. That may be what you want, but maybe not. If you want to make a quilt faster, if you want to make a quilt more accurately, and if you want to make a quilt for less money, the no-waste flying geese method is the way to go, and I'm going to show you how this works. The first step in accuracy is measuring. You want to measure and cut exactly what you need. And in this case, I'm using 7 1/4 inch large squares, 3 7/8 small squares. Now, there's a couple things that I do. You can cut it on your mat like this, but when you overlay a ruler on top of this grid and you're trying to get exactly into that point where you want, sometimes it can be hard to see. All these little lines can kind of create issues seeing here. So what I like to do, and I'm going to show you this on paper, is use my square ruler because I find I get better contrast. Now, you can certainly use a ruler like this, which is 6 inches wide for your small squares. But when you get bigger squares, it's sometimes easier to use the large square. And these come in all sorts of sizes. This is a 12 inch. Now, what you're going to do is I want to measure to 7 1/4 inches here and 7 1/4 inches here. So I'm going to lay this on my fabric and I'm going to get my 1/4 inch line here, my 1/4 inch line here, and my 1/4 inch line there. And I'm going to get everything lined up perfectly. Now, once I'm at this point, all I have to do is trim this off, and I'm good. I've got a great square, and I know it's accurate. You can do the same thing with the small ones, and let me show you here, doing it this way. We can use a small square. Again, it's a great option, and I want to cut this at 3 7/8. We're going to talk about that 3 7/8 in just a minute. Actually, this will be easier to see, I think, on the green. There we go. We can see that. So you can see it's not quite to 4 inches in both directions. And in doing that, I'm getting my line here of where to cut. So I line this up at 3 7/8. I line this up at 3 7/8. And then I cut on these two sides. If you have a large piece that you need to trim down to a smaller square, come in and cut one side. Then you've got this nice straight edge over here, and we want to go to 3 7/8 and 3 7/8, and there we are. Now, one thing I want you to notice here is, do you see when I have my 3 7/8, I have just the teeniest bit more on both sides? That's my fudge factor. I find by making this just slightly larger, just by a couple threads, this will fit better and it gives me more flexibility. You're going to find what works best for you, but I set it at 3 7/8, and then I move it just a little bit so that I have that extra couple threads to make everything fit nicely and give me more room. The reason I do that on these is these are the smaller blocks. As we sew them, they're going to cinch up a little bit. Now, another option that some people do, some quilters will set this just to the inside. I don't want to do that because I want my fabric to come all the way to the edge. Otherwise, when I get to where I'm going to be sewing in this corner, I may come up short on my seam allowance. So measure, absolutely accurate, and just a tad over. Slightly generous, not much, but a little bit. And that is going to create a much easier to assemble flying geese block. Measuring, absolutely important. Next, we need to mark it, and let me show you some ideas about that. First, I'm going to put paper down because I think it's easier to see on this mat, because there's a lot of green in these blocks and you may not be able to see very clearly. So the first thing we do with our small triangles is we're going to draw a line. This is not the stitching line, this is our guide. This is the center where we're going to cut our triangle. What we want to do is sew a 1/4 inch on each side of that line. Now, the reason that's important is we need to get our angles nice and straight so our geese have beautiful corners, beautiful points where they come together. Now, this is where one of the issues of accuracy can really play a part. You want your line to come right up into this corner. If you miss that corner by a bit here or a bit there, you're going to get a wonky goose, and we only want the best geese in our quilts. So you see how we come right into those corners. You do not want to sew at 1/4 inch right there, because if you do, then you're going to come up short. You want to sew, of course, I realize I just drew through my pretty fabric. Because that is going to go on the other side. I may be sewing over that. All right, next time I'll use a pencil. I just wanted you to see. Okay, so what we want to do is come in about this much. See how it's just to the inside, maybe by a couple threads. That's called a scant seam. That is going to make the sizing of your flying geese blocks much more accurate. It's going to give you more wiggle room. The reason that's important, think about this. When you sew on that line and you fold this over, you see how that fabric on the fold lifts. You get a little ridge there. Those are the threads that we're making up for. If we sewed right on that line that we needed, then when this were to be folded out, it would come up short because there's a couple threads in that fold. It's minuscule, but when you're dealing with a block like this that requires a lot of accuracy, you're going to realize a little difference like that can make a big change in your results. Tip number 3 will probably be very self-evident to you. While I do not always put pins when I'm sewing straight squares together and nesting seams, when you do a diagonal, you need to use a pin because diagonal seams are on the bias. When you work along the bias, fabric stretches and it moves, and that's going to create a problem. To avoid those problems, there's one simple thing we need to do. And tip number 3 is use your pins. It doesn't take a moment, but to put them in on each side. And what this is going to do is keep this fabric from twisting, from pulling. Basically, you're stabilizing your fabrics so that as you're sewing, nothing is going to move. And that is going to improve your accuracy. You've seen at times when you're sewing, fabric will tend to want to, do one of these as you're getting down to the end of the seam and you've got this buckle here and things are happening and that's going to be a mess. It's hard enough just with a regular square, but on the diagonal, when you have points, that really can be a challenge to straighten out. So again, we have our corners nice and square, everything's lined up. We have our center lines so that they lay over each other. As I'm sewing, I can follow that from one side to the other and hold it together with pins. This is the easy part. Now, let's go ahead and move on and see what comes next. Tip number 4 is something you've heard me talk about in making half square triangles. It also affects flying geese, and that is the scant seam. Scant means less than, slightly smaller, and not the full amount. So ordinarily, when I would sew, let me put my line right on this line here. We're going to put my ruler there. And you can see on either side this 1/4 inch and that 1/4 inch. Ordinarily, I would sew right on that 1/4 inch seam. But in this case, I am sewing right inside. And I'm going to see if I can point to it. You can see how that seam line comes right inside the 1/4 inch. That little bit is going to make a huge difference in how your quilt is going to finish up. And so once this is sewn, I'm going to pull the pins out and I'm going to cut this in half. Oop, that one's not going to work. We need a long ruler. And I'm excited to tell you, I had an extra piece of this fabric that I could cut out another square so I don't have to have blue ink in it. I can't believe I did that. Oh well, all for the cause, right? All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut down the line that I drew and create 2 pieces. This is your first step when you're making your flying geese. And then we're going to press this open and sew these. There we go. I've got a line there and there. Now, again, pressing is important. So press it with these seams going up towards the triangles. Then you're going to sew this. Now, let me show you some pieces that are sewn. This piece has been sewn. Like I said, we're going to fold this out. We'll press it really good and we'll line this square. Now, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to use that scant 1/4 seam. The trick, though, that I want to show you here is when you're setting this up, I can't hold it and do this. When you're setting up this block right here, this corner, you're going to measure here, make sure this corner fits well, and that these two corners are in a line with your background, your back fabric. That's actually your goose, but that back fabric. And then this here, this is the part that is going to really set your goose apart. Now, you see how this square fits in between that open area. What you're going to do, let me get my paper again, this seems to help. What you're going to do is you are going to stitch right in this little valley where those come together. And you're going to stitch just inside there, and that's going to be your scant 1/4 inch seam. You're going to come all the way down, back up, and again, you want to aim for that little valley right on the inside of it. So if you're right inside there and right inside there, you are going to be in great shape, and you can see that on here. Now, as I sew, when I'm cutting the threads, I do trim off those little corners, so that's why mine may look different. But by sewing right in those spots, you're going to get a really accurate seam. That's one of the critical points that I find make a difference. Have you ever gone to make a half square triangle or flying geese and you fold this over and they don't meet up? That's generally because this doesn't line up. So this is great for getting accurate results in a perfect flying geese block. Now, once these are sewn together, I'm going to come right on that drawn line and cut it apart. And now this is what my piece will look like. I will press that outward and press this outward, just like this. And again, press. It's really important to press these nice and flat. Because you're working on a bias, you do not want to press at an angle. Initially, you just want to press it. And press it in each direction. That'll get everything aligned where you want it to be. And then you can take your iron and move from side to side at these angles. Don't go diagonally, because that's going to stretch these bias seams. And then you may get some bulky looking flying geese, and we don't want to have, bulging flying geese. Now, the thing about this that I love is how little trimming there is, because these blocks are so accurate. And I want it to be, let's see, 3.5 by 6.5 wide. So if I put this right here, my block is just a smidge over 6.5 inches. And if I put my ruler here, this one is a little more over the 3 inches. So in trimming this, I'm going to trim off the bottom. I do not want to trim up here because I need that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I can, lose a little down here. So what I'll do is I will line this up, put this down here right on my square, square it on my grid and make sure everything's right where I want it to be. And then I'm going to cut it at 6.5. And it's not much that needs to come off, but that's what works really well, is there's minimal trimming on these blocks. I mean, this one I don't think even had any that I needed to trim off. And other than, of course, coming back and cutting off those dog ears. Let's see, 3.5, and let me pull this up here, and 3.5. Yeah, it's just a tad off. Now, do you notice how if I put my ruler from here to here, this bows in the middle? Because that's cut on a bias on these sides. That can tend to cause this part to stretch out. So if this stretches a little and this stretches a little, that's going to bow out. So I recommend not cutting that off. You want to trim this, and if you hold this in place corner to corner and you can kind of pull this down, If I can do, there we go. See how it actually sits straight and everything up here remains straight? Don't try and cut too much out of this center because you're going to lose fabric and you're going to lose your seam allowance. So pressing, yes, that's really, really important. We want to cut it, we want to press it, and then that's going to give us our beautiful flying geese. Now, for this particular pattern that I'm using, and most patterns with flying geese, is you put two together so that you have a square. And you can create a block that goes this way, or you can create a block that goes this way. You can do something like this. There's a lot of options in how you can put your blocks together. But notice the consistent part here is that there's two together side by side. And I want to show you how that looks. So here's one that's finished. And now I need to make, gosh, about 100 of these for this quilt. It's going to be gorgeous. But I wanted to go through this with you first so that you can go ahead and get some ideas that what works for you and try a few flying geese. So when I make this quilt, you're going to know exactly how it goes together. All these blocks are going to be put together, and I am going to make the remix geese. It's a free pattern by Robert Kaufman, and I'll have that link down below. And so we're going to talk about putting that together, putting them together in pairs like this. But maybe you want to put a couple nose to nose, and maybe you want to use stripes. And so we're going to talk about how to incorporate stripes and putting these blocks together so that you don't have stripes going this way. Let's see, I think I have, there we are. See how these stripes go this way and these go this way? I'm going to show you how to get 4 that all match. And it's so much easier than you think. You're going to laugh when you figure out that one. So here we are. We are good to go. We are going to be making a ton of flying geese. I need about 200 of each individual block, and that's going to make the quilt. You will love this quilt pattern. It's absolutely gorgeous. While it's made in a bright, colorful design, I love it. It'll be wonderful in the summer to make, some really hot, vibrant colors into a flying geese quilt like that. But it's Christmas, and I'm doing Christmas quilts, and I'm really excited how this is coming together. Besides, I am still trying to work through all my Christmas fabrics. I'm getting close. This one will take a big dent out of it. Okay, so we are there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are now aware and familiar with all 5 tips. Remember, the first thing is, number 1, you want to use the flying geese, the no-waste flying geese method, because it is so easy. You want to use accuracy in cutting and marking and making sure that everything is done correctly to begin with in order to get the best results. You want to use pins just to hold things together because you're working on the bias. We don't want any twisting. And one of the most important things is using a scant seam. That's really going to help you maintain the size that you need in order to get the best block possible. And the finale is to give it a good press. Make sure you press this down. And I'm sort of experimenting between sewing or pressing these in one direction versus pressing the seams open. So when we make the quilt for the next video, I'll have some ideas for you, and you can decide what works best that you like personally. All right, there we are. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching. I love that you follow along. It's such a pleasure to have you here, and I'm excited. I have a Christmas quilt to make. I will see you in a few short days. Have a wonderful rest of your day.